As we conclude Valeria Luiselli's essay in 40 questions, Tell Me How It Ends, I want to come back around to explore some questions about narrative boundaries here and points of resolution, what our expectations of those are. We've read this work as a work of nonfiction reportage, but it's written in a time of crisis. And so how do you report on a crisis like this? How do you report in the midst of a catastrophe where, as Luiselli writes, the idea of staying Tegucigalpa has become even more unimaginable. A situation of dire poverty and a situation of dire crisis. How do you report on it when violence drives millions of people north? She recalls a moment of a documentary on La Bestia, the train, where a poet writes, "To leave is to die a little, but to arrive is never to arrive." How do you report on a phenomenon like this? As with her other writing projects, Luiselli begins with a question of form, and she uses the questionnaire that is written for children who've been detained in crossing the U.S.-Mexican border. She begins with her frustrations with the questionnaire. So, how does it build a dialogue? And so she thinks about how the questions are written. Moments where she'll ask a child, "What did you do where you were from?" And the child will answer, "I don't remember." So how do you build a sense of narrative where memory fails, and how do you build a sense of narrative in the midst of this kind of catastrophic violence and migration? She also grows frustrated with the questionnaire as a tool where the places in which it seems to kind of just be trying to find those who will simply buy their immigration status by informing on gang members, or in selling information for the possibility of staying for as long as possible. And so she thinks about the frustrations within that as how people are used as tools here within the process. She thinks about the added layers of otherness that come in with the questions, how the questions distance people rather than trying to find points of connection and commonality. They just kind of like draw the children's stories into a further and further universe by the end. And what ends up happening is that she starts to realize that she doesn't want to write the answers to the questions directly onto the questionnaire, that she puts them down in a notebook first. As she notes on page 68, "I realized after several months of working in the court that it's better to write the children's answers in my notebook before copying them down on the intake questionnaire. One boy says the gang followed me after school and I ran with my eyes closed. I ran. So I write all that down and then in the margin make a note, persecution. And then he says more. Then they followed me to school and later they followed me home with a gun. So I write that down too and then make a note, death threats. And then he says they kicked my door open and shot my little brother. So I write that down too, but then I'm not sure what note to make in the margin. Home country poses life-threatening danger. Not in child's best interest to return. What words are the most precise ones? All too often I find myself not wanting to write anymore, wanting to just sit there quietly listening, wishing that the story I'm hearing had a better ending. I listen, hoping that the bullet shot at this little boy's little brother had missed, but it didn't. The little brother was killed and the boy fled, and now he's being screened by me. Later his screening, like many others, is filed and sent away to a lawyer, a snapshot of a life that will wait in the dark until maybe somebody finds it and decides to make it a case. So her frustrations here lead her to continue to dive into the phenomenon of the migration and its causes here. She builds some socio-historical context for how to think about immigration or how to discuss immigration as a phenomenon. She thinks about the shift in focus from the Rio Grande to the Mexico-Guatemala border that has occurred over the past decade. The shift in Mexican government policies regarding migration and detention. She also looks to locate or relocate the cause and effect behind refugees movement and motivation here. So, in the sense of constructing a narrative, looking for cause and effect, that in the past it was quite often economic reasons, but now it may be more about people fleeing violence in Central America, the drug gangs' violence, and children trying to avoid that violence or to avoid being pressed into gang service. One of the conclusions she reaches within this context is that that the United States can't see itself any longer as a distant observer or passive victim, but has to think about itself as an active participant in the cause and effect behind the migration that's happening here. And notes our own sense of how we engage this issue, that we're always wanting to locate a dividing line between, quote, civilization and barbarity, unquote, and to locate that somewhere below the Rio Grande. We want that kind of that sense of resolution, that sense of clarity in discussing this issue. And she voices her own frustration and kind of attempts to try to think about our own our frustrations as readers, as she explores these questions. Is there resolution there in the end? She notes her frustrations again and again within the essay. She's sharing some stories about girls that she's interviewed and her own children. Ask that question. But how does the story about those girls end? And she comes to the conclusion, I don't know. Earlier in the book, as she reaches a point of conclusion in the essay, she'll underline that these children are refugees of a war. I don't know how it ends yet. So there's a definite sense that this is just a moment or snapshot taken within the larger narrative of this migration. It's interesting how you might consider those brief postscripta as a conclusion here in this context, right? Is there an ending to the book, or in what ways are you satisfied by that ending? Do you find a point of resolution here? Even Manu Lopez's story, does it offer a sense of resolution to it in the end? He comes north from Tegucigalpa, and he has a document from the police there where he filed a report against gang members who were harassing him. And that, as she calls it, dead document becomes the opportunity that he might have to actually find a place in the United States. He becomes classified as a special immigrant juvenile, that Luiselli notes at the end of her postscriptus. However, is there resolution in that? As Manu in his story notes, that once he comes north, the harassment by gang members doesn't end. In his high school in Hempstead, New York, he continues to be harassed by gang members. As he says on page 83, Hempstead is a shithole full of MS-13s. So does he find resolution? There's the great final kind of images of him on a trampoline are interesting there, right? That he continues to be in motion, and without resolution. In the end, you can think about this work as essay and how it redraws narrative boundaries for you as a reader, perhaps. How it complicates a sense of any easy narrative here. As Luiselli writes on page 61, the interpreters have no control over the type of legal assistance a child receives. When we listen to their stories in Spanish and note key points in English, we must simultaneously pay close attention to the details and find ways to distribute them into categories. On the one hand, it's important to record even the most minor details from each story, because a good lawyer can use them to strengthen a case in ways that might not have been evident to an interpreter. On the other, though, it's not in the protocol. We often look for more general categories for each story that may tip the legal scale in favor of the future client in a future trial. Categories such as abandonment or prostitution, sex trafficking, gang violence, and death threats. But we cannot make up the answers in their favor, nor can we lead the children to tell us what is best for their cases, as much as we'd like to. It can be confusing and bewildering, and I find myself not knowing where translation ends and interpretation starts. That's the interesting thing about reading an essay like this, right? At what point, as a reader, where do you draw that line between your reading and your own sense of interpretation here, right? As you hear a narrative, how do the stories there work their way from just simple act of summary into a moment of analysis or synthesis, where you start to kind of build your own interpretation. She grows frustrated with stories in general in some ways. Right? In 69-70, she'll say, in the midst of taking these children's stories, telling stories doesn't solve anything, she writes it. It's simply a way of understanding the unthinkable. So how do you make the unthinkable into a narrative? And one of the conclusions that she makes in the book ultimately is on page 96, 97, as she tries to kind of think about her experience here. She writes about him in 96, there are things that can only be understood retrospectively, when many years have passed and the story has ended. In the meantime, while the story continues, the only thing to do is tell it over and over again as it develops, bifurcates, knots around itself. And it must be told, because before anything can be understood, it has to be narrated many times, in many different words and from many different angles, by many different minds. And that may be, in the end, the real power of Luiselli's work here, right, is that it introduces us to these narratives. It kind of forces us to kind of come face to face with these children's stories. And in the end, as she notes that to stay is the founding myth of this society, right? That sense of movement and migration, and how it redefines our sense of narrative here, the narratives of the Americas and our own stories within those larger stories of the Americas. That may be the real power of Luiselli's writing in this essay, is how it, through content and form, it forces us to reconsider how a new concept of the Americas might be emerging here.